The apartment smelled like cardamom and sesame oil the morning I deleted the first warning, because Noor was making fatted hummus and the windows were fogged from the steam. And I was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her move between the stove and the counter with this economy of motion. She had wrists turning, never reaching for anything twice. And my phone buzzed on the table with a notification from the city health portal. And I picked it up, read the first 2 lines, and swiped it into the trash. I want to be precise about that. I did not skim it. I did not misunderstand. I read the phrase potential biological exposure event and the phrase residence within a 1.6-kilometer radius of the following coordinates. And I looked at the fog on the windows and the way Noor was humming something low and rhythmless. And I chose to delete it the way you choose to cross a street against the signal, because you can see there's nothing coming. My name is Tariq Hassoun. I was 39. I managed the residential facilities portfolio for Astoria Property Group, which meant I was responsible for the mechanical well-being of 11 high-rise buildings along the Halifax waterfront. Boilers, elevator certifications, fire suppression, HVAC, generator load tests. I carried a clipboard in my mind everywhere I went. I noticed when exit signs flickered. I noticed when stairwell doors didn't seal. I noticed everything about buildings and almost nothing about myself, which Noor had been telling me in different ways for 3 years, and which turned out to be the most important diagnostic failure of my life. We lived on the 14th floor of the Marigold, one of my own portfolio buildings, which meant I knew every pipe in the walls and every seam in the roof membrane. And I'd walked the mechanical penthouse so many times, I could navigate it blindfolded. The Marigold was 22 stories of poured concrete and curtain wall glass overlooking the harbor. Built in 2011, reasonably maintained, home to maybe 400 people who thought of the building the way most people think of buildings, as a container that would continue containing them. I knew better. I knew the sump pump in the underground parkade had been flagged twice. I knew the standpipe system on the east riser had a valve that wept. I knew buildings were not permanent. I just didn't know that mattered beyond my annual inspection reports. It was a Tuesday in March. Halifax in March is a specific kind of gray. The harbor looks like pewter, the sky looks like older pewter, and the wind finds the gaps between your collar and your neck with a patience that feels personal. Noor and I had been together 5 years, married for 2. She was a pharmacist at the Sobeys on Barrington, and she had this way of cataloging the world that I loved. She'd come home and tell me about the prescriptions that worried her, not by name but by pattern. Someone's doctor is increasing their anxiety medication for the 3rd time in 4 months. Someone's picking up 2 courses of antibiotics in 6 weeks. She read people through their pill bottles the way I read buildings through their maintenance logs. We were both, I think, people who noticed systemic drift. And we were both, fatally, people who believed noticing was the same as responding. The fatted hummus was for her mother, who was coming for dinner that evening. Noor's mother, Samira, lived on the 9th floor of the Marigold, one of those arrangements that sounds suffocating until you see how it actually works, which in our case meant Samira had her own life, her own friends, her own schedule, and simply happened to be available when Noor needed her, and vice versa. I liked Samira. She called me Ya Ibni and corrected my Arabic with cheerful brutality, and once told me I had the soul of a building inspector, which I think was a compliment. So I deleted the notification, and then I put on my boots and my jacket and kissed Noor on the temple where her hair was pulled back tight, and I went to work. And I spent the day doing what I always did, checking things that could fail so they wouldn't. And I did not think about the notification again, not until the second one arrived. The second notification came 9 days later on a Thursday evening, and it did not come through the Health Portal app. It came as a registered digital advisory pushed simultaneously to my phone, my email, and the building's emergency communication system, which meant it also appeared on the lobby display screen, the elevator notification panels, and every unit's intercom if they hadn't disabled the function. I was in the mechanical penthouse running a quarterly check on the rooftop air handling units when my phone made a sound I'd never heard it make. A long, two-tone pulse that repeated 3 times. I pulled it out, and the screen was showing a government seal and a header in red that read, "Confirmed Exposure Advisory Individual Notification." And below that, in a font size I associate with prescription warning labels, my full legal name, my date of birth, my health card number, my residential address. And then a line that took me a long time to read, not because it was complex, but because my eyes kept sliding off it the way water slides off wax, based on biometric intake data collected at the following locations between March 3rd and March 9th. Your physiological markers are consistent with Stage 1 systemic exposure to compound NR7A. You are advised to report immediately to the nearest designated processing center for assessment and potential containment. Below that was a list of locations I had visited during that window. The lobby of the Marigold. Yes, I passed through it 20 times a day. The Sobeys on Barrington. Yes, I'd picked up groceries on the 5th. The parking structure at Purdy's Wharf. Yes, I'd had a meeting with our insurance adjuster. Each location had a timestamp. Each timestamp was correct. I put the phone down on the housing of AHU 3 and stood there with the rooftop wind finding the gaps in the penthouse louvers and listened to the drone of the supply fans and tried to understand what I was feeling. Which was not fear exactly, but something more architectural. The sensation of a load-bearing wall being told it was cracked and having no way to check. I called Noor. She picked up on the second ring. "Did you get it?" I said. "Get what?" "Check your phone." I heard her moving through the apartment, heard the particular sound of her picking her phone up off the kitchen island where she always left it, and then silence. And then a silence that was different from the first silence. The way a room is different after you've turned off a machine you'd stopped noticing was running. "Tariq?" "Yeah. It has my name on it too." That was the moment. Not when I got the notification. When I heard Noor's name was on one too. Because suddenly the document wasn't about me. It was about her. And everything I had treated as abstract for 9 days became a specific weight with a specific shape. And that shape was the sound of Noor's breathing going shallow on the other end of the line. "Come home," she said. Now, I came home. I walked down 18 flights because the elevator felt like a container. I didn't trust my body to be inside. And somewhere around the 11th floor, I stopped on the landing and put my hands on my knees and noticed that my palms were damp, and my pulse was visible in my wrists, and a faint metallic taste sat at the back of my tongue like a coin I'd been holding in my cheek. The stairwell smelled like concrete dust and the particular cleaning solution the janitorial contractor used on the handrails. And I stood there, breathing that familiar building smell, and asked myself honestly when the metallic taste had started. I didn't know. That was the answer that scared me. I didn't know when it started because I hadn't been paying attention to myself, only to the systems I maintained. Only to the things I was hired to notice, only to everyone else's infrastructure while my own went unmonitored. Noor had cleared the kitchen table by the time I got to the apartment. She'd printed both notifications, hers and mine, and laid them side by side, and she was sitting with her reading glasses on and a yellow legal pad, and she was already writing. This was Noor in crisis, not panic, not paralysis. Systematic triage. The pharmacist's brain. What do we know? What do we not know? What do we do first? "Sit," she said. Not unkind, just efficient. I sat. She'd already highlighted the key terms: compound NR7A, stage 1 systemic exposure, biometric intake data. She'd circled that last phrase twice. "When did they take biometric data from us?" she asked. "I don't know." "Think. Have you been through any new screening at any of these locations? A temperature check? A new entry system? Anything since February?" And then I remembered. The lobby upgrade. 3 weeks earlier, the Marigold's property management company, my employer, had installed new entry vestibule sensors as part of what we'd been told was an insurance-mandated air quality monitoring pilot. I'd signed off on the installation myself. The units were small, matte gray, mounted at the top of the vestibule frame, and they collected, we were told, particulate density, humidity, CO2, and VOC levels. Standard IAQ stuff. Nothing that would require tenant notification beyond a posted bulletin, which we'd provided. But the notification was referencing biometric intake data collected in that lobby. "The IAQ sensors," I said, "in the vestibule." Nor looked at me. "I approved the install," I said. She wrote that down on the legal pad without expression. And that absence of expression was worse than anything she could have said. Because Noor's face was a building I could read. And when she went blank, it meant the load was too heavy to distribute visibly. "Okay," she said. "What is an R7A?" I didn't know. She didn't know. We searched, and what we found was fragmented and institutional. A Health Canada advisory page last updated 6 days prior, referencing an aerosolized compound of indeterminate biological origin, detected in several Atlantic Canadian port cities, with Halifax, Sydney, and St. John listed. The advisory language was measured to the point of opacity. Under investigation. Precautionary measures. Monitoring protocols established in cooperation with provincial health authorities. There was a FAQ section with 4 questions and answers that all essentially said we are still learning. What we could piece together, NR7A was not a virus, not a bacterium. It was described as a synthetic adjacent aerosolized particulate, something that behaved like a chemical agent but appeared to have a biological delivery substrate, meaning it rode on organic material in the air. It had been detected first in shipping containers at the Fairview Cove terminal, then in ambient air monitoring stations across the downtown core, then in the lungs of port workers during routine occupational health screenings, which was apparently how the biometric detection protocols had been fast-tracked into building ventilation systems without clear public disclosure. The sensors in my lobby were not measuring air quality. They were measuring us. "Stage 1, Noor said, reading from the Health Canada page. "Asymptomatic integration phase. Compound bonds to mucosal tissue and enters systemic circulation within 72 hours of sustained exposure. No external symptoms, no pain response, no immune activation. It doesn't trigger an immune response? It says the compound is not recognized as foreign by standard immune pathways." She took her glasses off. "Tariq, it says stage 1 can last between 14 and 40 days. "And then what?" She put the paper down. "It doesn't say." The page for stage 2 was a placeholder. Information forthcoming. Consult your provincial health authority. A phone number. A second phone number. An email address with an auto-reply turnaround listed as 72 hours. I called the first number. Busy. Called the second. An automated recording that thanked me for my patience and informed me that current wait times exceeded 4 hours. I hung up. "We should go," Noor said. "The processing center. The notification says to report." "Where is it?" She checked. The nearest designated processing center was the Halifax Forum on Windsor Street, a municipal recreation complex. hockey rinks, and event space. Tonight, I said. Tonight. And that was where I made the first real choice of this story, the one I have turned over so many times, it's smooth as sea glass in my mind. Because I looked at Noor sitting at our table, organized, clear-eyed, ready to go. And I felt inside my own body not fear, but a strange, warm resistance, as if my blood itself was arguing against movement, against admission, against walking into a hockey rink and becoming a case number. And I said, let's wait until tomorrow. It's late. We'll go first thing. Noor studied me. Okay, she said. First thing. We did not go first thing. I went to work the next morning. I need you to understand how that sounds, and I need you to understand why I did it. And those are two different things, and neither one forgives the other. I went to work because I had 11 buildings and 400 units in my direct oversight. And the notification had come through the building's emergency communication system, which meant every tenant in the Marigold had seen it on their intercom panels, which meant my phone was already showing 19 missed calls from the property management office before I'd finished brushing my teeth, and because the building was my jurisdiction, and because moving through the familiar diagnostic rhythm of checking systems and reading gauges and documenting conditions was the only language my nervous system spoke fluently, and everything else. The notification, the metallic taste, the processing center, the word containment, was in a language I had not yet agreed to learn. Noor went to work too. That's important. She kissed me by the door and said tonight, and I said tonight, and we both went to our jobs. And I've thought about this so often that the memory has the quality of a photograph I've held too much. The colors faded, the edges soft, but the composition fixed. The Marigold was altered that morning in ways I could read because I read buildings. The lobby was 20% emptier than a typical Friday. The elevators were running heavier loads downward than upward, which meant more people were leaving than arriving. In the underground parkade, I counted 11 empty stalls that were usually occupied. The recycling room had an unusual volume of cardboard, shipping boxes, packing materials. People were leaving or preparing to. My supervisor, Gerald, called it 9:15. Gerald was a decent man in the narrow sense. He followed procedures, he filed reports on time. He did not actively make things worse. He spoke in a monotone that I'd once found reassuring and now found enraging, though I couldn't have told you when that shift occurred. We need a full HVAC assessment across the portfolio by end of business Monday, he said. The insurance people want to know if our air handling systems are positive or negative pressure relative to exterior, and they want the filtration specs on every AHU. And they want to know if we can retrofit HEPA on the intake. Gerald, the sensors in the vestibule. What about them? The IAQ sensors I installed 3 weeks ago. They're biometric monitors. They were collecting health data on residents. A pause. That's not what the spec sheet said. I know what the spec sheet said. I installed them. The notification I received last night references biometric intake data from my own lobby. Another pause, longer. I could hear Gerald's chair creak, which meant he was leaning back, which meant he was entering the posture he used when information exceeded his procedural architecture. Tariq, I need the HVAC assessment. I don't have guidance on the sensors yet. I've escalated to legal. Legal. That's right. Gerald, 400 people walked through that lobby. Their health data was collected without informed consent through a system I physically bolted to the wall. I understand your concern. I've escalated to legal. Can I have the HVAC assessment by Monday? I hung up. Then I did the HVAC assessment, because the alternative was to stop being the person who did the HVAC assessment. And I was not ready for that. Here is what I found across the portfolio that day. Building by building, 9 of 11 buildings ran positive pressure air handling, meaning they pushed more air in than they exhausted, meaning outside air, and whatever it carried, flowed inward continuously. The filtration standard across the portfolio was MERV8, which catches dust and pollen and large particles and does essentially nothing against anything measured in microns below 10. If NR7A was aerosolized at the particle size described in the Health Canada advisory between 0.3 and 1.0 microns, then every air handling unit in my portfolio was functioning as a distribution system. I was standing in the mechanical room of the Seaport Tower, our second tallest building, when that calculation completed itself in my head. I was looking at the supply fan, a large centrifugal unit pushing 12,000 cubic feet per minute through ductwork that branched to 160 units across 18 floors. And I understood with a clarity that felt physical, felt like the moment you step on a nail and the information reaches your brain before the pain does, that I had spent 3 weeks maintaining the ventilation systems that were delivering NR7AA to approximately 2,200 people. I sat on the mechanical room floor with my back against the electrical panel and the supply fan roaring above me, and I pressed my hands against the concrete and felt the vibration of the building doing what I had made sure it would do, which was breathe, pull air in, condition it, push it through ducts, into bedrooms, into kitchens, into the lungs of every person who trusted that the building was keeping them safe. The metallic taste was stronger. I probed it with my tongue. It sat at the base of my palate like a residue. I called Noor. "How are you feeling?" "Fine, busy. We had 112 prescriptions before noon." "Any taste in your mouth? Metallic?" Silence. Then, "How long have you had that?" "I don't know. A few days. Maybe longer." "I have it too," she said. "I thought it was the iron supplements." It wasn't the iron supplements. Samira came upstairs that evening without being invited, which was how she operated when she sensed atmospheric pressure dropping in her daughter's household. She arrived with a container of mujadara and the particular expression she wore when she had already decided what was happening and was simply waiting for us to confirm it. "You have not gone to the processing center," she said, setting the container on the counter. "We're going tomorrow," I said. "You said that yesterday." "Mom, we're handling it," Noor said from the couch, where she was reading something on her laptop with the focus of someone trying to find the bottom of a well with a flashlight. Samira sat at the table. She was 63, small, with hands that were always moving, folding napkins, adjusting salt shakers, reorganizing whatever surface she was near, and eyes that moved faster than her hands. She had been a nurse in Aleppo before the family came to Canada in 2014. She had a respect for institutional medicine that was simultaneously absolute and deeply suspicious, the way someone respects the ocean. Yes, it sustains life. Also, it has tried to kill people she loves. "I went," she said. Noor looked up. "This morning, to the forum. I received the notification too. 9th floor, same building, same air. Mom, I waited 3 hours. They took blood. They did a scan. Something with the throat, a scope. They gave me a number." She pulled a yellow card from her pocket, the size of a business card, with a printed number and a QR code. "Stage 1 confirmed. They said to wait for contact within 10 days. "And then what?" I asked. Samira looked at me with an expression I have thought about many times since. Not anger, not pity, but something closer to the look a building gives you when you read its maintenance log and find the entry that should have been actioned 6 months ago. A factual reckoning. Then they will tell us if there is a stage 2 and what it means. She stayed for dinner. We ate the mujadara and the leftover fatted hummus, and Samira told us about the processing center, the lines, the partitioned hockey rink, the military medical personnel who were polite but not friendly, the forms that asked for emergency contacts and next of kin. The forms asked about ventilation type at your residence, which stopped me mid-chew. What options were on that question? Central forced air, baseboard electric, radiator, heat pump, or other. What did you select? Central forced air, because that is what we have. I set my fork down. Central forced air. Every unit in the Marigold ran off the central HVAC system. MERV 8 filtration, positive pressure, 12,000 CFM through the building's ductwork like a circulatory system, and NR70 riding it like hemoglobin. Tariq, Noor said, watching my face. I need to make calls. Eat first. Noor. Eat first. I ate. Then I spent 4 hours on the phone and email. I called every building superintendent in my portfolio. I called Gerald, who didn't answer. I called Gerald's supervisor, a woman named Patricia Fenn, whom I had met twice and who listened to me describe the filtration situation and said, "Put it in writing and send it to me tonight, and CC legal." I wrote the email at the kitchen table while Noor and Samira talked quietly on the couch and the harbor wind pressed against the 14th floor windows with that particular low moan that meant the pressure differential was high, which meant the building was pulling even harder at outside air hunt through every gap and joint, and the HVAC intakes were running at maximum draw. I wrote, given the confirmed particulate size range of NR7A 0.3 to 1.0 microns, and the current filtration standard across the portfolio, MERV 8, effective only above 3.0 microns, I am formally advising that every central air handling unit in our 11 buildings is currently functioning as a distribution vector for the compound. I recommend immediate shutdown of all supply-side air handling and a transition to natural ventilation until HEPA-rated filtration, MERV 17 or higher, can be installed on all intake plenums. I sent it at 11:47 p.m. Patricia Fenn's auto-reply said she would respond within 1 business day. By the time I got the response, shutting down the air handlers would no longer be the relevant question. Over the next 6 days, I became 2 people, and both of them were exhausted. The first, Tariq, moved through the portfolio buildings with his clipboard and his access keys and his intimate knowledge of mechanical rooms, systematically documenting every HVAC system specification that might matter. Filter grades, airflow volumes, duct velocities, return air ratios, outside air percentages, economizer settings. I pulled maintenance records going back 3 years. I photographed filter housings. I measured static pressure drops across filter banks to determine how clogged they were, because a clogged MERV8 filter actually catches smaller particles than a clean one, which meant the dirtiest buildings in my portfolio might paradoxically be the safest. A fact so absurd, I laughed out loud in the mechanical room of the waterfront terrace, and the sound bounced off the concrete walls and came back unfamiliar. The second, Tariq, was monitoring his own body with the same systematic attention he gave to buildings, and finding it harder to read. The metallic taste was constant now, faint but permanent, like a flavor note in water from old pipes. My sleep had shifted. Not insomnia exactly, but a strange shallow quality, as if I were resting on a surface rather than sinking into depth. Noor reported the same. We'd both wake at 3 or 4 a.m., not startled, not anxious, just awake. And we'd lie there in the dark, listening to the building systems, the faint hum of the HVAC, the elevator motor engaging 12 floors below us. And neither of us would say anything, because saying something would make the waking into a symptom rather than an inconvenience. On the fourth day, Patricia Fenn responded to my email. She thanked me for my diligence. She informed me that the company had retained an environmental health consultant to review the portfolio's ventilation systems. She asked me to continue my documentation and to refrain from making any operational changes to the HVAC systems until the consultant's assessment was complete. I read that email standing in the lobby of the Marigold. Directly beneath the vestibule sensor, I had installed the small matte gray unit that was, as far as I could tell, still collecting biometric data from every person who walked through the door. I looked at it for a long time. It was mounted with 4 Tapcon screws into the concrete header. I had drilled the holes myself. I had run the low-voltage wire myself. I had tested the connection to the building management system myself and confirmed the data link was active and thought I was measuring air quality and congratulated myself on a clean install. I went to the maintenance shop and got my drill and a number 3 Robertson bit and went back to the lobby and removed the sensor from the wall. It took 90 seconds. The wire dangled. I put the sensor in my jacket pocket. It weighed almost nothing. That evening, I put it on the kitchen table, and Noor looked at it the way she looked at a prescription that contradicted another prescription. Professional recognition of a system failure. "There's probably one in the Sobeys too," she said. "Probably." "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know." "Then why did you take it down?" I had to think about that. The honest answer was that removing it felt like the only action available to me that operated at the scale of the problem. A single concrete gesture in a situation that was otherwise entirely abstract and institutional and invisible. I couldn't see NR7A. I couldn't feel it in my lungs. I couldn't measure my own stage 1 integration or know what it was integrating toward. But I could remove a sensor from a wall. I could hold the instrument that had cataloged my exposure and Noor's exposure and Samira's exposure and the exposure of every person in my building. And I could put it on a table and look at it and know it was no longer looking back. "Because I put it up," I said. Noor nodded. She didn't tell me it wasn't my fault. She didn't tell me it was. She just picked up the sensor, turned it over, read the manufacturer label, wrote the model number on her legal pad, and added it to the file she was building. On the 6th day, the Health Canada website updated the NR7A advisory. Stage 2 had a description now. It was 7 paragraphs long and clinically worded, and Noor read it aloud to me and Samira in our living room while the harbor fog pressed against the windows and the building hummed around us. Stage 2 onset, 21 to 45 days post-exposure, characterized by progressive perceptual integration. The compound, once bonded to neural tissue, began altering sensory processing thresholds. Hearing sharpened, smell intensified, tactile sensitivity increased. This sounded initially almost benign, an enhancement. But the document continued. The sensory amplification was not uniform. It targeted social perception channels preferentially. Stage 2 subjects reported an increasing inability to tolerate deception, ambiguity, or social performance. Not as an emotional preference, but as a neurological sensitivity. The brain became, essentially, allergic to dishonesty. The compound stripped the buffer between perception and response, between what you noticed and what you could bear. The document called it perceptual disinhibition. The practical consequence, in clinical terms, was that stage 2 subjects could not sustain normal social interaction. They could not tolerate polite fictions, strategic omissions, white lies, or the ambient dishonesty that constitutes the structural material of civil coexistence. They responded to perceived deception with acute distress ranging from nausea to seizure. A society of people who cannot tolerate each other's necessary lies. That was stage 2. I looked at Noor, Noor looked at Samira. Samira was already looking at both of us. "The whole city?" Samira said. "Everyone exposed," Noor said. The first visible collapse in Halifax came 11 days after the second notification, not through violence or infrastructure failure, but through something quieter and stranger: the disappearance of public speech. I noticed it in my buildings first. Tenant complaints dropped to zero, not because problems were solved, but because the interaction required to file a complaint. The diplomatic language, the strategic framing, the calibrated emotional register you use when you want a building manager to fix something without alienating them, had become physiologically difficult for people entering stage 2. I walked through lobbies that had been full of small talk for years and found them silent. Not hostile, not fearful. Silent the way a room goes silent when everyone in it is listening to something only they can hear. The superintendent at the Seaport Tower, a man named Declan Firth, who'd been in the role for 15 years and who communicated almost entirely in genial complaints and weather observations, called me on day 13 and said, in a voice stripped of every texture I associated with him, "Tariq, I can't do this job anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean when Mrs. Chow in 1408 tells me her bathroom fan is making a noise, and I know she actually wants me to do something about the cigarette smoke from 1409, but she won't say it directly. And I know I'm supposed to understand the real request without her stating it. I can't do that anymore. I hear both things, the stated thing and the real thing, and the gap between them makes me physically ill. Declan, I'm not being dramatic. I vomited in the corridor on 12. The gap between what she said and what she meant hit me like a smell, like sewage. I could taste it. I wrote this down. I was keeping a maintenance log now, but not of buildings, of people, of the system I actually lived inside, which was the community of a building, the social infrastructure that was as real and as fragile as any mechanical system, and that I had never thought to inspect because it ran on a fuel I couldn't measure it. Trust, pretense, tact, the willingness to let small lies pass. The city scaled Declan's experience by 100,000. The radio stations went strange first. Call-in shows collapsed because hosts couldn't maintain their professional personas, and callers couldn't tolerate the host's performative neutrality. Municipal council meetings were abandoned after 2 sessions, in which council members, unable to employ diplomatic language, said things to each other so stripped of political cushioning that 3 physical altercations occurred. The hospitals were overwhelmed not by physical injury, but by the neurological distress of healthcare workers, who could suddenly perceive every patient's unspoken fear and every colleague's suppressed exhaustion and every administrative lie about staffing levels. All at once, all with the volume turned up past tolerance. Noor came home from the Sobeys pharmacy on day 15 and sat on the hallway floor without taking her coat off and said, "A woman brought in a prescription for her husband and told me he was doing better. And I could see, I could feel Tariq, like a physical object in the space between us. That she knew he was dying and she was performing hope, because she believed that was what the situation required of her. And the contradiction between her words and her knowledge was so loud in my head that I couldn't read the label on the bottle. I sat next to her on the hallway floor. The building hummed around us. 14 floors of ductwork and copper pipe and concrete, and people who were slowly losing the ability to be near each other without agony. "Can you feel it with me?" I asked. She looked at me. "That's what I keep checking. And you're the only person I've spoken to today where what you say and what you mean are close enough together that I can stay in the room." That should have been a comfort. It wasn't, because it meant the compound was testing something between us that I had always assumed was solid. and finding it solid. And the relief of that finding was contaminated by the knowledge that it might not last. That the closer my own stage 2 progressed, the more I would perceive, and the more I perceived, the more I might find in Noor or in myself that could not survive scrutiny at this resolution. The processing centers closed on day 16. Not officially. They simply stopped functioning because the military medical staff could not interact with each other or with patients without the social lubrication that makes institutional operation possible. The yellow cards meant nothing. The QR codes linked to servers that were still running, but that no one was updating. Samira, who had been a nurse in a war zone and who had, I think, a tolerance for bare truth that most people do not develop under peaceful conditions, was the steadiest of us. She came upstairs every morning and made coffee and said what she meant and asked what she needed to ask. And did not flinch when we answered honestly, because Samira had spent decades in a profession where the gap between what was said and what was real was often the gap between life and death, and she had long ago stopped letting that gap surprise her. In Aleppo, she said one morning, stirring sugar into her coffee with a precision I recognized as Noor's inheritance, we did not have the luxury of polite lies. When there is shelling, you say there is shelling. When someone is dead, you say they are dead. This compound, it is not making people sick, it is making them Syrian. I almost laughed. Noor did laugh, a short, surprised sound that broke something loose in the room's air pressure. It is making everyone tell the truth, Samira continued. And the truth is that this city was held together with tape. And the tape was the small lies, and now the tape is gone. On day 19, I made the decision that I cannot undo and do not fully understand. And that sits in me now the way a repaired fracture sits in a bone. Stronger at the site, but you feel it in weather. The HVAC systems were still running. Patricia Fenn's environmental consultant had never materialized. Gerald was unreachable. I later learned he had left the city on day 12 with his family. The property management company's office was dark. The institutional chain of authority that had governed my professional life had dissolved like sugar in water, quickly and completely. And I was standing in its absence with 11 buildings full of mechanical systems that I was the only remaining person qualified to operate. The buildings were still breathing, pulling outside air through MERV8 filters, pushing NR7A through ductwork into units where people were living through stage 2 in various states of distress, isolation, and adaptation. I had the access codes. I had the training. I had the tools. I could shut them down. Every air handling unit across 11 buildings. Kill the supply fans, close the outside air dampers, let the buildings go still. People would lose heating. March in Halifax, the units would drop to 10 degrees Celsius within hours. They'd lose ventilation. CO2 would build, air quality would degrade. But NR7, a delivery would stop. The choice was between cold, stale air and warm, contaminated air. And the mathematics of that choice were not simple because cold kills slowly, and NR7A's stage 2 was making communal survival impossible in ways that cold alone would not. But there was a second option, and this is the one that found me at 2 a.m. in the Marigold's mechanical penthouse with a headlamp and a box of MERV17 HEPA filters that I had driven to Dartmouth to buy from an industrial supply warehouse that was still open because its owner, a woman named Ruth Braddock, was stage 2 and had apparently found that honest commerce was one of the few interactions the compound didn't punish. 13 buildings in my portfolio, 27 air handling units total. Each AHU had between 2 and 6 filter banks. To retrofit HEPA filtration across the entire portfolio would require approximately 140 filters, and Ruth had 63 in stock, and they cost $14 each. And I put them on my personal credit card because there was no company card anymore, and no company to bill. 63 filters, 27 AHS. I could not cover everything, so I had to choose. Which buildings, which floors, which people? This is the dilemma I still carry, not whether to act. I was going to act. That much was decided the moment I removed the sensor from the wall. But how to allocate protection across a population that didn't know I was making the allocation? I was the maintenance log. I was the building inspector. I knew which buildings had the sickest residents, which had the most children, which had the highest density, which had the worst existing ventilation, which had residents who were adapting to stage 2, and which had residents who were decompensating. I knew this because I had been walking through them every day, keeping my log of people, tracking the social infrastructure the way I tracked mechanical systems. I started with the Marigold, my building, Noor's building, Samira's building. I retrofitted the 4 main AHS between midnight and 4 a.m. Working alone in the mechanical penthouse with the March wind hammering the louvers. The HEPA filters were thicker than the MERV 8s. They barely fit the housing, and the static pressure drop was severe, which meant the fans were working harder to push less air, which meant the motors would burn out faster, which meant I was trading long-term system life for short-term filtration. A building management decision I'd have flagged in any normal inspection. But nothing about this was normal, and the motors were a problem for a future that might not exist. After the Marigold, I drove to the Seaport Tower, where Declan Firth was still living alone in the superintendent's apartment despite being unable to perform his job. And I retrofitted 3 of that building's 5 AHS before I ran out of filters and had to leave the 2 units serving the upper floors untouched. I stood in the Seaport Tower mechanical room at 6 a.m. with empty filter boxes around my feet, and knew that the residents of floors 15 through 22 were going to keep breathing unfiltered air, because I had spent my filters on floors 1 through 14. And this was a decision I'd made based on population density, more units below 14, but also based on the fact that Declan lived on 3. And I knew Declan, and the people above 14 were names on a tenant list I had never met. You want to believe resource allocation in a crisis is rational. You want to believe it's triage. It's not, it's who you've shared a coffee with. It's whose name you know. It's the weight of a single human interaction, tipping a calculation that should be mathematical into something brutally personal. I had 31 filters left, 9 buildings uncovered. Ruth Braddock called me at noon that day, which was day 20. Her voice on the phone was the most direct I had ever heard a stranger speak, which I was learning to recognize as the stage 2 baseline. No preamble, no social positioning, just the architecture of the thought delivered without insulation. You bought 63 HEPA filters yesterday, and you look like a building manager and not a homeowner. How many buildings are you responsible for? 11. Then you're short. I'm getting another shipment from the supplier in Moncton on Thursday if the driver makes it. He's stage 2, and he told me he can still drive because the truck doesn't lie to him. I'll hold what you need. How much? Same price. I'm not going to profit from this. But I also can't give it away because the warehouse insurance is still auto-debiting, and I need the account to stay open. Ruth Braddock became, in the space of that phone call, the second most important person in my operational world. She was 57, short gray hair, the kind of broad hands that come from decades of moving heavy inventory. She ran the warehouse alone now. Her 2 employees had left the city. She slept in the back office on a cot. She was, by her own blunt admission, better suited to stage 2 than most people because she had spent 30 years in industrial supply, where lying about product specifications could get people killed. And she had never developed the habit. "You're filtering buildings," she said. How are you deciding which ones? Badly, I said. At least you know that. I drove to Dartmouth every day that week. Ruth's shipment arrived on Thursday as promised, 84 more filters, which brought my total to 115, still short of the 140 I needed, but close enough to cover the critical units. I prioritized by a formula I built in my head and refined in my log. Population density times vulnerability index times existing filtration gap. The vulnerability index was my own invention, crude but honest. I weighted for age, known medical conditions from supers reports, number of children per floor, and proximity to external air intakes. But the formula was a fiction, and I knew it. The formula was the lie I told myself to make the allocation feel objective, when in truth, every building I walked into shifted the calculation because I saw faces and heard voices and smelled cooking and noticed shoes outside doors, and each of these details attached to the numbers a human weight that the formula couldn't carry. I filtered 9 of 11 buildings by day 23. The last 2, the Quinpool Arms and a small walk-up on Robbie Street. I couldn't reach because the Quinpool Arms had a mechanical room lock that required a key I didn't have. The super had left and taken it. And the Robbie Street building's AHU was so old that HEPA filters would have stalled the fan motor immediately. For the Quinpool Arms, I broke the lock. I have never broken into a building mechanical room before. I used a pry bar from my truck. The lock was a standard alloy, and the hasp was bolted into wood framing, not steel. And it took less force than I expected. I installed the filters in 20 minutes and left through the service entrance and drove home and sat in my truck in the Marigold's underground parkade for a long time, smelling the concrete and the cold and the oil stains. And I realized that I had spent 23 days maintaining buildings, which was my job, which was my identity, which was the only thing I knew how to be, and that every act of maintenance had been, simultaneously, a confession and an atonement. I had installed the sensors that cataloged the exposure. I had maintained the systems that delivered the compound. And now I was filtering those same systems to slow what I had helped distribute. There is a word for this, but guilt, isn't it? Because guilt implies you chose the harm, and I didn't choose it. I was simply the mechanism through which it moved. And responsibility isn't quite it either, because responsibility implies authority, and I had none. The word I settled on, eventually, was involvement. I was involved, not as an agent, as infrastructure. I was the building's hands, and the building had done what buildings do, which is move air. And the air had carried what the air carried. And now I was trying to make the building's hands do something different. And the building didn't know and didn't care, because buildings don't have intentions, only systems. And systems do what they are configured to do. The change came on day 26, and it didn't come from the compound, or the government, or the collapsing social infrastructure. It came from Noor. She was sitting on the couch with her laptop closed and her hands flat on her thighs and looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face. And I understood immediately that stage 2 had brought her to a perceptual threshold, where something between us was now visible that had previously been tolerable only because it was blurred. "You haven't told me something," she said. "I can feel it. I've been feeling it for 3 days, and I need you to say it, because the weight of it in the room is making me nauseous." I sat down across from her. The harbor was invisible behind fog. The building was quiet. The retrofitted HVAC running at reduced airflow. The filters catching what they could, the motors straining. "I don't know what you're sensing," I said. And that was true, because there were several things I hadn't said, and I didn't know which one was loudest. "Try." So I tried. I told her about the allocation formula, about how I'd filtered the Marigold first, about Declan's building second, about the order of the rest, and the logic I'd used, and the ways the logic was contaminated by personal knowledge, and the Quinpool Arms lock I'd broken, and the Robbie Street building I couldn't help. I told her all of it with the precision of a maintenance report, because that was the language available to me. She listened. Then she said, "That's not it?" "Nor. The thing you're not saying. The thing that's been in this apartment since the first notification, since before the first notification." And then I knew what she was perceiving, because I felt it too. Had felt it for weeks, maybe months. Had buried it so deep that only a compound designed to strip the insulation from human perception could reach it. "I noticed the first notification," I said. "I read it, I understood it, and I deleted it because I could not afford to be a person to whom this was happening. Not because I thought it was spam, not because I was busy, because if I acknowledged it, I would have to become someone who was contaminated. And contaminated people don't maintain buildings. They get maintained. They become cases. They become the thing on the other side of the clipboard. And my entire identity, everything I am, everything I have been since I was 22 and got my first building certification, is the person holding the clipboard, not the person described on it. And I couldn't let go of the clipboard, not even for you." Nora's hands stayed flat on her thighs. Her breathing didn't change. The stage 2 perception that made other people's dishonesty unbearable was, in this moment, doing something else. It was allowing her to receive a truth she had already sensed without needing to translate it through anger or hurt. She was hearing me the way I heard a building. Structurally, reading the load paths, finding where the stress concentrated. "You deleted it to stay useful," she said. "Yes. And then when the second one came, and it had my name on it too, you still went to work the next morning." "Yes. Because working was the only way you could keep being the person who fixes things instead of the person who is broken." "Yes. And every building you filtered, every filter you installed, every mechanical room you walked into at 2 a.m., there was you trying to earn back the 9 days you spent pretending the first notification didn't exist." I didn't say yes to that one. I sat with it. The apartment was so quiet, I could hear the HVAC supply register above the kitchen ticking faintly as the reduced airflow shifted the damper blade, a sound I'd heard 10,000 times and never consciously registered until a compound in my nervous system turned the volume up. "I don't know if that's what it was," I said. "But I know it's close enough that I can't argue." Nor leaned forward. She put her hands on my hands, which were resting on my knees, and her palms were warm and dry, and I could feel her pulse in her fingertips, or maybe that was mine. And she said, "I am not angry. I am not forgiving you either. I am telling you that I can now perceive the exact shape of how you love me. And it is the shape of a man who would rather maintain every building in the city than sit still long enough to be afraid for himself. And I need you to know that I see it. And it is not enough." "What do you mean, not enough?" "I mean that maintaining systems is not the same as being present. I mean that filtering my air is not the same as telling me you're scared. I mean that I have been married to a building inspector for 2 years, and I have been perfectly, thoroughly maintained. And I have been lonely the entire time. And the only reason I can say this to you now, without it destroying us, is that the compound won't let either of us pretend I didn't say it." There it was. The thing stage 2 was actually doing. Beneath the social collapse and the institutional failure and the public speech disappearing. It was performing an audit, not of buildings, of the distances people maintained inside their closest relationships, the polite gaps, the functional silences, the things left uninspected, because inspecting them might reveal a deficiency that would require more than a work order to repair. I sat in that sentence for a long time. Noor didn't retract it. She couldn't. Stage 2 doesn't allow retraction, because retraction is a social performance, a taking back that requires pretending the original statement was excessive, and the compound won't let you perform that pretense. What is said stays said, fully weighted in the air between you. I am scared, I said. I know. Not of the compound, of what it's showing me about how I've been. I know that too. Samira knocked on the door at that moment, and I have wondered since whether she heard us through the wall. Her unit was directly below, and the building's acoustic separation between floors was, I knew from tenant complaints, inadequate. Or whether she simply sensed the atmospheric change the way she always did. She came in with her coffee cup and took one look at us, sitting across from each other, with our hands touching, and said nothing, and sat in the kitchen chair and waited. We were being honest, Noor said. Good, Samira said. It's the only medicine this thing responds to. The city restructured itself in the weeks that followed, not through government directive or emergency management, but through a process that looked, from my vantage point, exactly like what happens when you change a building's operating parameters and let the systems find their new equilibrium. The people who left Halifax, and there were many, in the first 2 weeks especially, before the highway checkpoints went up and the compound was confirmed in every Atlantic province, were mostly people whose lives depended on the social performances that Stage 2 made impossible. Politicians, salespeople, middle managers, lawyers, anyone whose professional function required strategic ambiguity. They didn't leave because they were sick. They left because their careers had been neurologically eliminated. The people who stayed were a different demographic. Tradespeople, nurses, farmers from the outlying communities who drove in for supplies, mechanics, fishers, people whose work involved material reality, things that were either fixed or broken, caught or lost, built or not built, and whose social interactions had always been more direct than the cultural norm. Ruth Braddock stayed. Declan Firth stayed once he realized that his inability to translate Mrs. Chow's indirect complaints was no longer a disability because Mrs. Chow was now telling him directly about the cigarette smoke. And 1409 was admitting to smoking inside. And the three of them had an honest conversation about ventilation solutions that, Declan told me later, was the most efficient tenant interaction of his 15-year career. Samira stayed. She volunteered at what had been the processing center and was now an informal community clinic run by the healthcare workers whose tolerance for unvarnished reality made them Stage 2's natural leaders. She came home each evening with reports that sounded less like medical updates and more like anthropological field notes. Observations about which social structures were reconstituting and which were permanently dissolved. The couples are the interesting ones, she told us over dinner on day 30. The couples who were honest with each other before. They are fine. Better than fine. The compound has nothing to show them, but the couples who were maintaining each other the way Tariq maintains buildings. She glanced at me, not unkindly. Those couples are either breaking apart or breaking open. There is no middle anymore. Noor and I were breaking open. That is the most precise language I have for it. Every evening we sat at the kitchen table and said things we had never said. Not because we'd been hiding them, but because they had existed in a register below conscious access, in the infrastructure of the relationship, in the maintenance log neither of us had read. I learned that Noor had wanted to ask me for years to talk about whether we wanted children, and had never asked because she perceived that the question itself would cause a system failure in me, a cascading anxiety about adequacy that I would manage by working more and being present less. And she was right. And knowing she was right, and knowing she had protected me from knowing she was right, was the most painful and most loving thing I had ever been shown. I told her I had spent our entire marriage afraid that if I stopped being useful, I would stop being necessary, and that maintaining the building we lived in was, at some level, I couldn't fully articulate, a proxy for maintaining her, because buildings didn't leave when you inspected them honestly, but people might. "I won't leave," she said. I know that now. But I knew it before too, in the part of me that does the inspections. I just didn't know it in the part that deletes the notifications. The HVAC systems held. The HEPA filters I'd installed across the portfolio reduced NR7 a delivery to a fraction of its previous volume, which didn't reverse stage 2 in anyone already exposed, but slowed the progression in new residents, and, according to the community clinic, seemed to stabilize the perceptual sensitivity at a level that was intense but manageable. Sharp enough to make lying difficult. Not so sharp that proximity to others caused seizure. I checked the filters every 3 days, replacing them on a cycle Ruth and I worked out together based on particulate loading rates she measured with equipment she'd sourced from a laboratory supply company in Moncton, whose owner was also stage 2 and also, apparently, thriving. Patricia Fenn never responded again. Gerald never came back. Astoria Property Group's office remained dark, and after 6 weeks, I received an automated email from their payroll system informing me that my direct deposit had failed because the originating account was frozen. I was no longer employed. I was still maintaining 11 buildings. The distinction between those two facts felt less relevant each day. On day 41, the federal advisory was updated for the last time, during what I would call the acute phase. NR7A was reclassified from a temporary environmental contaminant to an irreversible neurological modifier. Stage 2 was permanent. The compound did not degrade. The perceptual changes would not reverse. The population of Halifax, and Sydney, and St. John, and every community in the Atlantic provinces where the compound had arrived through port infrastructure and ventilation systems and the simple movement of air, was permanently altered. I read the advisory in the Marigold's mechanical penthouse, sitting on the same spot of floor where I'd sat the day I understood my buildings were distribution systems. The supply fan was running. The HEPA filters were doing their work. The building was breathing clean air now, or cleaner. And the people inside it were living in a city that was reorganizing itself around a single new constraint. You could not lie. You could omit. You could stay silent. You could choose not to speak. But if you spoke, the words had to match the interior, because everyone around you could feel the gap if they didn't. And the gap hurt, physically, like a sound at the wrong frequency. Nor came up to the penthouse that evening. She'd never been up here before. It wasn't a space for residents, just mechanical systems, and the people who serviced them. She stood in the doorway and looked at the AHS and the ductwork and the filter housings and the tangle of controls and sensors. And she said, "So this is where you live. This is where I work. Tariq, this is where you live. This is the room where you are most yourself. I've been married to you for 2 years, and I've never seen it." She walked to AHU1 and put her hand on the housing. The metal was warm from the motor. The fan vibrated faintly under her palm. "You changed these filters to protect us," she said. "I changed them because it was the only thing I knew how to do." Those are the same sentence. I looked at her standing in the mechanical room with her hand on the air handling unit that fed our apartment, and I felt, with the full perceptual bandwidth that stage 2 provided, the exact weight of what she meant. Not that I was forgiven. Not that the 9 days I deleted didn't matter. But that the way I loved, which was through systems, through maintenance, through the obsessive stewardship of infrastructure that kept other people safe, was visible to her now in its entirety. And she was choosing to stand inside it with her hand on the machine. And that was not absolution, but it was presence, which was what she'd asked for, and which I was learning, slowly and clumsily, to offer without a clipboard between us. "I'm going to keep maintaining the buildings," I said. "I know. Not because Astoria is paying me. They're not. Because the buildings still need it, and I still know how. I know. But I want to come home at the end of it. Actually home. Not to the 14th floor to review my notes. Home to you." Nor took her hand off the AHU. She walked across the mechanical room, stepping over conduit and around pipe risers with the careful gait of someone in an unfamiliar space. And she stood in front of me and put her hands on my face. Her palms were warm from the machine. "Then come home," she said. "I maintain 11 buildings in Halifax. I am not employed. I am not paid. I buy filters with money from a community fund that Ruth Braddock administers out of her warehouse, which has become something between a supply depot and a town hall. Because Ruth's direct manner and her unwillingness to tolerate inefficiency make her ideally suited to a social environment where pretense has been chemically removed. Declan Firth maintains the Seaport Tower. He is better at his job now than he has ever been, because the tenants tell him what they actually need, and he tells them what he can actually do. And the gap between those two things is managed through negotiation rather than inference. He told me last week that Mrs. Chow and the smoker in 1409 are friends now. They had a fight first, he said, a real one, screaming in the hallway. But it was an honest fight, so it ended, and what was left was two people who understood each other's actual situation. Samira works at the clinic full-time. She is, by all accounts, one of the most effective practitioners in the city, because her baseline tolerance for unmediated truth was already calibrated to conditions most people are only now learning to navigate. She has started training others, not in medicine specifically, but in what she calls the practice of surviving honesty, which is a set of skills she developed in Aleppo and refined in Halifax, and which involves, as far as I can tell, the willingness to receive a true statement without immediately converting it into a problem to solve or a wound to treat. Sometimes the truth is just the truth, she says. It doesn't need a response. It needs a witness. Nor still works at the pharmacy. The practice of pharmacy has changed. Patients describe their symptoms with clinical specificity now, unfiltered by embarrassment or minimization, which means diagnoses are faster and more accurate, but interactions are longer because the full truth of a person's physical experience takes time to hear, nor comes home tired in a different way than before. Not the tiredness of navigating politeness, but the tiredness of being fully present to suffering that is no longer decorated with social performance. She says it is better. She says it is harder. She says she does not want the old version back. I go to the mechanical penthouse every morning. I check the filters, the fans, the static pressures, the motor temperatures. I walk through the building and I listen. To the HVAC, to the elevators, to the stairwell doors, to the particular sound a building makes when its systems are running within tolerance. And then I listen to the other thing. The thing I spent my career not hearing. The sound of the people inside the building, the actual human system that the mechanical system exists to serve. The 400 lives that depend on air and heat and water, and also on each other, and on the willingness of someone to notice when something drifts. The metallic taste is gone. It faded around day 35, replaced by nothing. Just normal sensation, normal taste. The baseline of a body that has integrated a change it did not choose and cannot reverse. I still notice it sometimes, the absence of it. The way you notice the silence when a machine you'd stopped hearing finally shuts off. Something was there. Something changed. The change is permanent. And what's left is not the person I was before the first notification, and not the person I was when I deleted it. It's whoever I am now, which is a man who maintains 11 buildings and comes home to a woman who can see exactly how he loves her, and has decided that the shape of it, imperfect and indirect and routed through ductwork and filter housings, is worth standing inside. There's a sensor mount on the lobby vestibule wall where I removed the biometric monitor. 4 empty Tapcon holes in the concrete header. I haven't patched them. Nor asked me why, and I told her the truth, because that's all that's available to me now. I leave them there, so I see them every morning. When I walk through the lobby, 4 small holes where a device used to be. A reminder that I was the mechanism, that the building did what I configured it to do, that systems don't have intentions, only operators, and the operator has to choose what the system carries. I choose clean air. I choose it every day, not because it undoes what I distributed, because it's the next thing the building needs. And I'm still, despite everything, the person who shows up to provide it. The last thing I want to tell you is about Noor's hands on the AHU housing. The warmth of the motor through the metal through her palms. She told me later that she could feel the vibration of the fan. And through the fan, the vibration of the air moving. And through the air, the faintest trace of all the filters I'd installed across the city. All the small interventions I'd made in mechanical rooms at 2 a.m. while she slept 14 floors below. And she said it felt like being held by someone who didn't know how to hold you directly, but had arranged the entire room so that the temperature was right, and the air was clean, and the door would open when you needed it to. That's not enough, she said, but it's what you have. And I'm here. I keep the 4 Tapcon holes unpatched. I check the filters every 3 days. I come home. I am learning at 39 in a city that can no longer tolerate the distance between what is said and what is meant, to close the distance in myself. It is the hardest maintenance I've ever performed. The building does not have a manual for it, neither do I. But the air is clean, and I come home.